Hana Habjan ens explicarà el procés de secessió dels arxius amb la independència d'Eslovènia. Gràcies.
I would first of all like to thank members of the committee for inviting me, and to respectable members of the Congress, the purpose of this paper is to present development of Slovene archival network, inclusion of Slovene archives in Yugoslav archival system, and difficulties or challenges Slovene archives had to face in the transition period and dealing with succession issues. Beginnings of development of Slovene archives in the start in the 19th century and stem from activities of various individuals and institutions such as convents and landed estates, museum societies, and city administration. Municipal Archive of Ljubljana, predecessor of Historical Archives Ljubljana, was established in 1898 as the first archival institution in Slovene lands. In 1918, Slovenes and Croats joined with kingdoms of Serbia and Montenegro into kingdoms of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which was from 1929 onwards known as Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and will be hereafter referred as Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia did not establish new archives for archival materials of all state administration, but rather encumbered with this task the State Archive in Belgrade, former state archive of the Kingdom of Serbia. It was not until 1950 that State Archives of Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was established as a central archival institution on federal level. During both wars, Municipal Archive of Ljubljana, Regional Archive in Maribor, and a few archival departments comprised Slovene archives functioning solely on regional or municipal basis. During the Second World War in 1944, Scientific Institute within the Slovene National Liberation Movement was founded to collect records created by partisan civilian and military administration as well as occupation forces. In March the same year, all committees, institutions, organizations, and printing shops which were publishing materials for the public were instructed to send in 2 copies of every print to the Scientific Institute. Thus, a large collection of national liberation print was gathered and is still kept by appropriate institutions, such as Institute for Contemporary History, as well as the National Archives of Slovenia. Setting up new social order in Yugoslavia in 1945 meant archival materials became public property. Most of important private archives became state-owned, either through nationalization or forced deposit. That same year, the Central State Archives of Slovenia was established, followed by special archives. Archives of the Communist Party were not supervised by the state and were accessible based on political criteria. Special archives were established on federal level as well. Diplomatic archives of the Federal Secretariat of Foreign Affairs, keeping records dating from 1918. Archives of the Federal Secretariat of Internal Affairs, also with records from 1918, archives of the Armed Forces of Yugoslavia within War Historical Institute, with records from 1918, but also keeping records created between 1941 and 45 by occupational forces as well as partisan forces from the entire Yugoslavia. Central Committee of League of Communists of Yugoslavia, which was established in 1948, and Archives of Memorial Center Josip Broz Tito, established in 1964, collecting documents connected with President's life and work. Military Geographic Institute, Yugoslav Cinematheque, Film News, etc. were also established and important archives on federal level. And all these archives would later become subject to succession claims by former states of Yugoslavia. Between 1950 and 73, a network of regional archives such as exists still today developed. 6 regional archives were covering Slovene territory. However, the fact that they were regional in a country where administration was operating on a state and local level with no in-between level meant they had difficulties operating in between. One of the difficulties was financing. Based on the Natural and Cultural Heritage Act from 1981, several municipal communities and socio-political communities could together hold founder rights for one regional archive, and thus financing from all their financiers had to be coordinated. In the case of Historical Archives Ljubljana, there was some 40 financiers during the period of socialist self-government in 1980s who required annual, semi-annual, often also 3-month reports on archives work. After the independence of Slovenia, this was abolished and financing was transferred to the Ministry of Culture. And also the transfer of founder rights in the founding of new archives was transferred to the state, executive rights to the government of the Republic of Slovenia. In the first draft of the Archival Act after Slovene independence in 1994, it was stated that in order to process archival materials equally, archives needed support from the state, which is aware of the importance of public interest in synchronized regulation of archival activities. Regional Archives Maribor objected throughout to founder rights being transferred to the state, arguing that historical development of archives should not be excluded. Nowadays, Slovene state archives still maintain different statuses. State archive on republic level is part of state administration, Ministry of Culture, whereas regional archives are public institutions since 1991, financed from the state budget, also Ministry of Culture, but otherwise autonomous. In 1986, Center for Technical and Professional Problems in Archives was founded in Slovenia on the initiative of Dr. Peter Paul Klesinc, Director of the Regional Archives Maribor and organizer of the archival meetings in Radenci in Slovenia, which were open to participation of Yugoslavian and foreign archivists and which still takes place every year. Center was renamed as International Institute for Archival Science in 1992 and was to deal with technical and professional problems linked to archival matters, taking in special consideration of the Balkan-Danube area and improving quality and professionalism of archival services. Archival legislation in Slovenia and Yugoslavia prior to 1991. Between 1945 and 1986, 89 laws and regulations were issued regarding archival profession in Yugoslavia, of which 13 were issued by Slovenia. State Archives Act in 1950 was the first general act on archives for the whole Yugoslavia. The act did not acknowledge differences between state and private archival materials and obligated religious communities to transfer their records to state archives. It established a federal archive, today Archives of Yugoslavia, taking in records of central authorities from 1918. Archive Materials Act of 1964, that was a year after adoption of a new constitution declaring socialist democracy on basis of social property and self-government, declared archival materials social property, apart from materials of civilian legal persons, referring mostly to religious communities. Based on a new constitution, Socialist Republic of Slovenia issued Archival Materials and Archives Act, which was the first such act of its kind in Slovenia. After June 1971, with the adoption of constitutional amendments, which enabled greater competences of republics, the General Act on Archives no longer applied, and the republics were thus able to regulate their archival legislation and archives activities independently. In 1981, Socialist Republic of Slovenia issued Natural and Cultural Heritage Act, which regulated functioning of culture institutions, including archives. This act was a reflection of the period in which it was formed, being based on the concept of social property, meaning that custody as well as property relations were adjusted to the concept of administrating and disposing with archival materials as social property. This meant that socio-political communities were entitled to assert their rights within the socio-planning system, to form their opinions regarding protection of natural and cultural heritage, and to supply means for the upkeep, basically to allow public to take a very active part in this whole process. Additional defect of this act was regulation of diverse institutions in the field of culture and nature preservation within a single act, which was an exception in Europe, But from if I understand correctly, the same was in Spain in the mid-1980s. This act also enabled or continued special archives which were abolished in 1990 and gradually incorporated into the National Archives. Archives and Archives Material Act from 1997, that was after Slovene independence, was a result of changes in political system, local administration, denationalization, privatization of social property, and was in accordance with international standards regulating archival profession. All aspects of the law shall not be discussed here, only those most relevant and influenced by new circumstances. Draft of 1997 Act developed from 1989 onwards, together with cooperation of archival experts from ICA and member states of the European Union and European Community, so it included most of the resolutions, directives and instructions of the EU and Council of Europe regarding custody and access of public and private archival materials and unification of retention period. In 1994, two representatives of ICA, Jean-Marie Jean, Director of the Archives of Paris, and Matthias Mann-Stanner, Director of the State Archives Canton Basel City, visited Slovene archives. The aim of their visit was to establish current situation in Slovenia in the field of archival legislation, training of archivists, informatization, educational and international activities of archives, establishing the situation of repositories and preservation of archival materials during the period of great social changes in the Republic of Slovenia and suggesting improvements. The report established a positive situation of design draft of Archival Act in general, apart from some reservations regarding private archival materials and the state's interference with ownership rights of private archival materials. The Denationalization Act of 1991 ascertained that the right of ownership of archival materials kept in public archives returns to their former owners, but not also in their possession because of their importance for Slovene cultural heritage. In 2000, the Nationalization Act was slightly modified, whereby a constitutional court stated that owners are entitled to right of ownership or compensation. In 1997 Act, it was established that archival materials, once social property, become public property and private archives constitute private property. Factories, companies and institutions, once social property, becoming private, no longer had a duty preserving and transferring their archival materials to state archives, but had to transfer all archival materials created before 1991 to state archives. However, here another twist occurred because these private creators wished to keep archives created by their predecessors, stating they required it for continuation of their work. A compromise was made where the creators were allowed to keep technical documentation and building plans. However, many of these archives were, during the course of the former Yugoslavia, sent to federal archives in Belgrade because of the importance of creators, and still have not been obtained. Social and political changes taking place in Slovenia before its declaration of independence in 1991 also affected creators of archival materials. In September 1989, amendments to a constitution of Socialist Republic of Slovenia were passed, enabling political parties and direct elections. At the end of 1990, elections took place, and many of the former socio-political organizations, such as Socialist Youth League of Slovenia, League of Communists of Slovenia, Socialist Alliance of Working People, which were the leading socialist organizations and transformed themselves into political parties, were not elected to the parliament. These parties consequently lost financing practically overnight and were forced to let go of their staff and headquarters. Their records were in certain cases lost due to ignorance and or negligence of their creators. But the legislation regarding archival materials of socio-political organizations prior to 1991 stated they must transfer their archival materials to archives 5 years after their date of creation. For other creators, different retention periods were valid. For judiciary organizations, it was 30 years, as well as for various societies. A retention period was unified for all creators in 1997 with some exceptions, but access to the archival materials of former socio-political organizations in state archives was not restricted, except for data relating to the privacy of an individual. During development of the law, certain political parties considered archives of socio-political organizations neither public nor private, but other parties opposed, stating that such provisions are not in accordance with legal state. Nevertheless, this article was included. Actions undertaken by Slovene archives during the War for Independence of Slovenia in 1991. On 27th of June 1991, Yugoslav People's Army attacked Slovenia, who had just 2 days previously declared its independence. Armed conflict, which was the first of its kind in Europe after the Second World War, lasted until 6th of July. Over 60 people, military and civilians, lost their lives in those 10 days, with numerous communication and road infrastructure damages. Slovene archives began preparations for possible war activities before conflict erupted. Degree of their reaction varied. The regional archives Maribor moved all microfilms to a dislocated location, as well as ensuring greater safety of archival materials. Staff were on duty in all archives. During the war, no greater damage occurred with regard to the archival materials still preserved by the creators. In certain cases, uncontrolled and fast destruction of documentary materials took place. They were stored in shelters that were required for use by employees during air raids. Nevertheless, later analysis showed it was mostly non-archival materials that were destroyed. Based on stipulations of National Defense Act, part of the documentation was purposely destroyed. Again, it was a case of mostly non-archival materials. In the regional archives Maribor, they telefaxed messages to over 50 addresses across the world informing of the situation in Slovenia, and indeed great international media coverage of the conflict, pressuring the representatives of international political bodies, also contributed to a fast conclusion of the war. International recognition and registering the archives of the Republic of Slovenia and Archival Society of Slovenia with the International Council on Archives commenced in autumn of 1991 without any problems encountered during the procedure. Succession issues and restitution of archives and archival agreement prior to 1991. Succession issues, succession rights are not a new issue regarding Slovene heritage. After the First World War, the territory of the Republic of Slovenia, previously part of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, became part of Yugoslavia, with a small part annexed to Italy, but returned to Yugoslavia after the Second World War. Many archives pertaining Slovene territory remained beyond our borders, and archival issues were resolved with peace treaties and archival agreements after both world wars, with different results. Due to its numerous experiences with restitution, Yugoslavia brought up this subject at the 18th General Conference of UNESCO in 1974 by submitting resolution on return of archival materials which had been transferred by former capitals and occupiers to their territories back to the countries of origin. Consequently, the General Conference adopted Resolution 4.212, which was ratified and received general approval. This resolution also had an impact on formation of Vienna Convention in 1983 on succession of states in respect of state property, archives, and debts, which was also signed by Yugoslavia but never ratified. With the dissolution of Yugoslavia in 1991, which was a chaotic process compared to dissolution of the Soviet Union or Czechoslovakia, new states had to come to an agreement regarding succession issues on archives. Already in July 1991, shortly after the War for Independence of Slovenia had ended, Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Republic of Slovenia designed a suggestion for negotiations within the Peace Conference on Yugoslavia with representatives of Federal Secretariat for Foreign Affairs of Yugoslavia based on recommendations from Slovene archivists. In spring of 1992, Peace Conference set up a special group to deal with succession issues, which was chaired successively by Portuguese Ambassador Dovale, followed by Foreign and Commonwealth Advisor Henry Darwin. Within the International Conference on the Foreign Yugoslavia, Danish ambassadors Jørgen Boyer and Al Johnson were in charge of a special group relating to succession. Meetings were held on regular basis with all parties attending. The special group took up a classical approach to resolving succession issues, being more in keeping with the Vienna Convention of 1983, opinions of the Badinter Commission, Yugoslav Constitution of 1974, and practical experiences of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Badinter Commission established that by mid-1992, Yugoslavia no longer existed and that it was a case of dissolution. It considered this approach considered the estate as it was and not as it should be, and had most support of successor states with the exception of Serbia and Montenegro. In July 1992, talks on succession issues, including succession of archives, were held in Brussels, which were attended by Director of the Archives of the Republic of Slovenia, Maria Oblakčani, as member of Slovene delegation. And indeed, that the preparation of the technical files intended for use in such negotiations be entrusted to professional archives was also a recommendation adopted by the International Conference of the Round Table on Archives in Cagliari in 1977. Other states had in their delegations also archival representatives, mostly directors of national archives, but they would not attend negotiations regularly except for Mrs. Oblakčani. She presented the basis for Slovene negotiation on succession of archives relating to the Vienna Convention of 1983 and professional advice on the Vienna Convention on succession of states in respect of state property, archives, and debts, formed by a group of experts nominated by the ICA in 1983. The Serbian delegation was of the opinion that the archives of Yugoslavia are indivisible and should remain in Serbia. However, they were willing to give free access to successor states. Serbia issued a decision in late 1991 on turning Archives of Yugoslavia, which was a federal institution, to an institution of a Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Serbia and Montenegro between 1992 and 2003 were known as former Republic of Yugoslavia, but I will use the term Serbia. There were clear differences regarding professional basis, which was to serve as basis for succession and division of assets. Mostly it had to do about the end of the state, whether it was a case of newly independent state, as was stated in the Article 28 of the 1983 Vienna Convention. This was the Serbian viewpoint. Serbia removed this viewpoint upon Croatian protest and was then in favor of Article 30, which dealt with separation of part or parts of the territory of a state. It was Article 31 that received Slovene and Croatian support and dealt with dissolution of a state. And that is because this allowed equitable division of archives. In January 1993, it was established by the Working Group on the Succession Issues that the basis for negotiations would be Vienna Convention of 1983. And on 10th of March 1993, draft report of the Working Group on Succession Issues, succession of the ex-Yugoslav states in respect of state archives, was prepared in Geneva under Jørgen Boyer, which would form the basis for further negotiations. It was based on 1983 Vienna Convention, as well as internationally accepted professional principles and guidelines issued by ICA and UNESCO and other international organizations, including opinions 8, 9, and 10 of the Arbitration Commission, which established the end of Yugoslavia by July 1992, and that it was in fact a process of dissolution, meaning that all states were equal successors. The report defined the concept of state archives, taking its definition from Article 20 of the Vienna Convention, and that only state archives produced or received by central government and its institutions since 1980 and federal government and its institutions since 1945 can be subject to succession. It was even explained that even if a broader sense of definition of Article 20 is adopted, in accordance with Article 31, the volume of state archives would again be reduced merely to those produced and received by central or federal agencies. The question of definition of state archives, however, continued even in 1997. And it should be mentioned here, though, that Article 20 of the Vienna Convention of '83 defines the term state archives too loosely. That is, it does not specify federal and regional archives or that of republics, which can be subject to manipulation. And that was also the opinion of the professional advice. That it states that the definition of the term state archives as worded in Article 20 does not exclude divergent interpretations. An important concept in the 1993 draft was that of joint heritage or custody, which ICA appointed experts in 1983 worded as follows: archive groups created by administrations, functions of which are shared between the predecessor state and the successor state or states as a result of the succession of states, may be declared in the Special Archival Agreement joint heritage. Rights and responsibilities connected with the custody of and access to the joint archival heritage shall be specified in the agreement. This concept appealed the most to archival representatives taking part in the negotiations, but definition differed amongst them and talks never progressed during this period in this direction. One of the major tasks of a special working group was to propose an equitable division of assets and liabilities of the former Yugoslavia intended for apportionment. But because archives cannot be estimated in the same way, an appraisal was prepared on protection of the most endangered archives. For this purpose, in November 1993, all 5 states attended a meeting in Vienna sponsored by the Commission of the European Community and Austrian State Archives. The aim was action plan on microfilming, protection and preservation of endangered archives, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Delegations set out their priorities regarding microfilming of endangered archives. In charge was Dr. Hans Hofmann of the Historical Archives of the European Commission and head of the Working Group for Archives, who prepared the estimate necessary to carry out this task. Negotiations came to a standstill and were resumed only after the signing of the Dayton Agreement in 1995. Due to lack of progress during this time regarding archives, the government of the Republic of Slovenia, being aware of the importance of archives, also considered arbitration. In 1996, Sir Arthur Wards was named as special negotiator for succession issues within the Peace Implementation Council, which was established in December 1995. And in May and June of that year, he visited former republics of Yugoslavia in order to get to know the situation better. During a course of numerous multilateral and bilateral meetings between 1996 and 1998, Sir Wards designed draft texts referring to 1978 UNESCO 20th General Conference and 83 Vienna Conventions and report of 10th of March 1993 with various formulations on the legal basis. But none of the drafts received support of all successor states. Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, that is Serbia, saw the end of Yugoslavia in 1991 throughout the negotiations, not as a dissolution, but rather as secession of republics, meaning that Serbia was the only real predecessor and therefore successor. Consequently, there was no progress. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Macedonia, and Slovenia finally signed agreement on succession issues in Vienna on 29th of June 2001. Slovenia ratified the agreement in 2002. The last state to ratify it was Croatia, and on 3rd of June 2004, the agreement entered into force. It was possible to finalize an agreement because several changes occurred in the political world previously to that time. The end of Slobodan Milosevic's regime, Serbia giving up thesis that they are the only legal successor of former Yugoslavia and joining United Nations as a new member in November 2000, all had a positive impact on continuation of negotiations with successful results. The agreement is made of preamble and 12 articles based on general principles, final provisions, and 7 annexes referring to most important issues of succession of former Yugoslavia. In preamble of the agreement, it is stated that the 5 successor states share sovereign equality to the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Mentioned is the Security Council's Resolution 1022 from 1995 of the desirability of a consensual solution to outstanding succession issues, and that successor states demonstrate their readiness to cooperate in resolving outstanding succession issues in accordance with international law. Annex D, which discusses archives, took one of the longest to formulate because of Serbia's insistence on continuation of former Yugoslavia, and even after resuming negotiations in 1995, Serbia tried to keep archives in Belgrade as joint heritage. Final text of Annex D was based on Vienna Convention of 1983, internationally acknowledged professional archival principles, and draft report of 10th of March 1993 formulated in Geneva by Jorgen Boyer. Annex D was formed on principles of restitution based on provenance, that was Article 2, transfer based on functional pertinence, Articles 3 and 4, respect for the integrity of groups of archives, Article 6b, and joint heritage, 6a. Transfer relates to the concept of functional pertinence as devised by UNESCO at the 20th General Conference in 1978, stating that the purpose of transfer of archival groups is to provide administrative continuity for all parties involved. It also states that archives groups accumulated by administrations responsible solely for the affairs of a given non-sovereign political entity, whether or not the administrations operated within and were located within the territory of that political entity, form part of the heritage of the successor to the political entity concerned. The object of succession is Yugoslav archives produced or received by the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia or by any previous constitutional structure of the Yugoslav state since 1st of December 1918 in the exercise of its functions, and which on the 30th of June 1991 belonged to Yugoslav Federal Archives. Archives of republics were exempt. After this agreement was made, several meetings between representatives of archives followed with the intention of making actual plans on how to execute the agreement. The deadline for determining equitable distribution of archives, other than those referred to in Annex D, Article 3 and 4, or their retention as common heritage, was within 6 months of the entry of the agreement into force. But it expired on 2nd of December 2004 with nothing accomplished on this score. Slovene government established in November 2001 Committee for Archives. Head of the committee is every current director of the Archives of the Republic of Slovenia, and there are also 2 representatives from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, a representative of a diplomatic archives in the ministry, thus representing ministry's interests regarding archives of the diplomatic archives, and a lawyer for international law who makes sure that procedures are conducted in accordance with provisions of the agreement. Due to lack of joint efforts, Slovenia increased individual negotiations and bilateral agreements on cooperation followed, signing with Archives of Serbia and Montenegro, as Archives of Yugoslavia were renamed for a while, and Archives of Serbia in December 2004 respectively. In 2005, such an agreement was signed with military archives. It stated that Slovene experts cataloging archival groups for succession have unhindered access to the materials and good working conditions, and that access is granted to legal and natural persons to use the records for administrative, business, and personal purposes, provided that they prove legal interest. Researchers have to comply with Serbian archival legislation regarding access to archival records, which is 30 or 50 years accession date. After a long correspondence between the archives of the Republic of Slovenia, the archives of Yugoslavia, diplomatic archives, and military archives in Belgrade, first cataloging of archival groups conducted by Slovene archives commenced in 2003, and in accordance with Serbian archival legislation regarding access to archival materials, and not in accordance with the agreement which stated immediate and free access to former states. With the agreement entering into force in June 2004, 24-month deadline began, during which a list of archival groups had to be made in accordance with Articles 2, 3, and 4 of Annex D. The National Archives issued an appeal to creators of archival materials to submit the list of archival groups that should be restituted to Slovenia or are required by them in administration process. In May 2006, these lists were exchanged among successor states, including Serbia. Other successor states insisted that these lists remain open in the sense that they can be added to, because many creators still have not transferred their records to archives. Additional demands would be processed according to specified criteria. In 2009, archivists from the archives of the Republic of Slovenia began cataloging finding aids containing records interesting for Slovenia. In order to determine content of some of the records, certain fonts were inspected. Copies and photographs of finding aids, as well as of some of the records, mostly as samples, were made. And in 2014, the archives of the Republic of Slovenia plan to publish results of their 10-year work, referring mainly to all the records of various federal ministries. The aim is to encompass entire ministries, which will be of great help to researchers. Slovene archivists have also executed several cataloging on behalf of Slovene ministries, for instance, for Second World War reparations. In May 2012, International Conference of Archivists from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia took place in Bosnia. They discussed progress regarding the agreement and expressed their concern due to its slowness. Remarks were made that certain fonts still cannot be located, such as those of Federal State Security Services and Federal Ministry for Internal Affairs. Regarding Articles 3 and 4, there has been so far no implementation of those provisions, that is, functional pertinence. And the conclusions at the conference were to strive for free access to archives, and for this purpose to arrange a meeting of high representatives of states, and also to use social networks for better communication and exchange of professional opinions. In the agreement made in 2001, all the principles formed by UNESCO and ICA on archival claims were considered: functional pertinence, common heritage, respect for the identity of groups of archives, and restitution based on provenance. Considering all this, individual negotiations regarding implementation of the agreement, diplomatic activities, bilateral agreements, especially in view of the fact that there are no sanctions provided in the agreement, are possible solutions for its conclusion among successor states. The agreement of 2001 is in certain cases rather unspecific. The reason behind it is a pragmatic approach that had to be used in order to accomplish the signing of the agreement. Without a doubt, goodwill of all parties involved and their respect of international law and principles regarding archives in view of their internal law is the decisive factor. Parties can achieve a satisfactory solution, but it requires a good basis provided by experts, in this case archivists, adherence to the principles designated by ICA and UNESCO, exclusion of political character, and awareness that archives constitute general cultural, political, and economic heritage and are therefore above politics. Now, to conclude, Slovenia stepped on the path of independence in 1991 well prepared. By that time, it had already independently developed its own archival legislation and archival network. Legislation regarding archives nevertheless had to be adapted to new political and social situation and the aim of archival science in Slovenia was to approach to international archival standards as prescribed by ICA. With a shift in social order, Slovenia was nevertheless unable to completely avoid controversy, which found its way into archival legislation after 1991. This is indicated in removal of all restrictions of access on the use of archives transferred by the authorities and organizations of the former Yugoslavia and of socio-political organizations up to 1991, except for materials which include sensitive personal information. Former Republic of Yugoslavia, that is, former Yugoslavia, initiated Resolution 4.202 in UNESCO in 1974, which supported return of archives to countries to which they relate, being aware of their great importance for their history. Yugoslavia was also active in discussions and preparations of expertise regarding return of archives in international organizations. But less than 20 years later, Yugoslavia herself had to deal with dissolution and the difficult process of resolving succession issues. Negotiations on succession lasted for 10 years, and implementation of the agreed is currently still underway. In the agreement on succession issues signed in 2001, successor states agreed that each successor state acknowledges the principle that it must at all times take the necessary measures to prevent loss, damage, or destruction to state archives, state property, and assets of the former Yugoslavia, in which, in accordance with the provisions of this agreement, one or more of other successor states have an interest. Prevention of loss, damage, or destruction of archives is a transnational obligation, an obligation to which all states who regard themselves as legal states, progressive and modern, should adhere to. Thank you.